Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You know what the news is. In a minute, you're going to hear the rest of the story. Now, the rest of the story. I want you to meet Steve. Steve is an overworked, underpaid English teacher at Hampton Academy near Hermon, Maine. He and his wife and their newborn daughter live in a double-wide mobile home which they rent. Wife Tabitha, although a college graduate, feels fortunate in the current economy to have found work as a waitress at a Dunkin' Donuts in Bangor. You see, Steve's $6,400 a year salary does not pay for much. Even together, Steve and Tabitha cannot afford to repair their 7-year-old car, which barely runs, or to keep their telephone, which the phone company has recently removed. And, oh yes, Steve has started drinking. Now you can imagine why, but you ought to hear the rest of the story. As long as he was stuck with an English teacher's salary, Steve figured that he might as well permit himself an English teacher's dream, to publish a novel and to become rich and famous thereby. Well, he more than dreamed. Bless his heart, he tried. I mean, Steve, on a teacher's schedule which demands evenings and weekends for grading papers and planning lessons, somehow found the time to write an entire book. Sitting up late every night, plunking away on his wife's tiny portable typewriter, which he had placed on a tiny table in the trailer's tiny furnace room, Steve wrote what he believed was the great American novel. He called it Blaze. The publisher to whom he sent it called it boring, and back it came. Okay, that was a misfire, Steve told himself. Blaze was just a requisite warm-up for the real thing. The next great American novel he clacked out in the furnace room, he entitled Getting It On. What a title, Steve thought, and what a book. The publisher's reply was, please stop bothering us. But Steve was undeterred. He continued to write. His third novel, The Running Man, was different, if only because of its sad similarities to Steve's own life. For in The Running Man, the hero is a fellow who finds himself unable to provide for his wife and child. So he takes a terrible risk. He becomes a contestant on a game show that'll either win him a fortune or kill him. Well, the ring of symbolic truth notwithstanding, The Running Man was rejected by Doubleday, and was rejected by Ace Books, and that did it. Steve tossed the novel in a drawer and poured himself another scotch. As for the book, it stayed in the drawer for almost a decade. Steve was finally forced to face the facts. He was a low-paid teacher whose family was probably destined to starve. He was never going to write the great American novel. He may never write anything ever again. Of course, not even Steve could have guessed how very stubborn and stupid he would turn out to be. Stubborn and stupid, enough to try yet again. The following year, he wrote a fourth novel. He called this one Carrie, the first in a long succession of successful horror stories that would transform a struggling English teacher into the world's richest and most famous author of scary fiction, Stephen King. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. When I was in high school, I was drawn to Stephen King's books. Though my mom worried about the content I was reading, she knew that Stephen King was referred to as the King of Horror. But we need to take a look at Stephen King when he was a king, but not the king. Stephen King was born in 1947 in Portland, Maine, to Donald Edwin and Nellie Ruth King. Young Stephen's father wasn't always a king. You see, he was born Donald Edwin Pollock. When Donald was 16 years old, he was still using his original surname, Pollock. But by the time he was 23 years old, he was going by the last name King. The reason behind the name change and the selection of the name King remains a mystery. After learning his father's real last name in 2014, Stephen King quipped that Stephen Pollock just didn't have the same ring to it. In that year, 2014, Stephen King appeared on an episode of the PBS show Finding Your Roots. I'll leave a link in the description where you can watch the whole episode for free. In the episode, the show's host showed Stephen a picture of this man and asked if he knew who it was. Stephen was unaware that he was looking at a picture of his father. You see, in 1949, when Stephen was just 2 years old, his father went out for cigarettes and never returned. Stephen quipped that it must have been a hard pack to find. Now, when Stephen was a little older, his mother told him, "When people ask you why he left, say he's in the Navy and then he's at sea, because that might not be a lie." Donald was a naval officer and served as a captain in the Merchant Marines until 1956. Donald died in 1980. Stephen remembered that as a teenager, he said if he ever met his father, he would sock him in the mouth. But he never did. The last time he saw his father was when he was 2 years old. When Stephen was growing up, his mother read Fate magazine to him. Fate magazine focused on paranormal phenomena. The stories fascinated the young boy. Stephen was interested in nightmares, scary stories, and things that go bump in the night. That was a direct quote. "I wanted to be scared," he said. "I just did." Stephen said he was about 6 or 7, just copying panels out of comic books, and then he began making up his own stories. One day, Stephen copied a comic book panel and showed it to his mother. She responded, "I bet you could do better. Write one of your own." Now, it was almost as if he had never considered this before. The possibilities were endless. Stephen said it was as if I had been ushered into a vast building filled with closed doors and had been given the key to open any I liked. Whereas it normally takes a writer years of hard work with many rejections before anyone is willing to pay for something they've written, Stephen was lucky and found a buyer. By the age of 9, his Aunt Gert was paying him a quarter for every story he created. That'd be about $2.50 in today's money. Now that is the true definition of positive reinforcement. Thank you, Aunt Gert. Stephen's earliest surviving story was one that he sold his Aunt Gert in 1956 or 57 called Jonathan and the Witches. It was first published in 1993 as part of the anthology First Words, Earliest Writings from Favorite Contemporary Authors. As a child, Stephen read just about anything he could get his hands on. He said, "I read everything from Nancy Drew to Psycho. My favorite was The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. I was 8 when I found that." Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly wasn't reading anything that advanced when I was 8 years old. One day while in his local bookmobile, Stephen asked the librarian, "Do you have any stories about how kids really are?" She suggested Lord of the Flies. If you haven't read Lord of the Flies, let me explain what it's about. A group of prepubescent boys who were stranded on an uninhabited island attempted to govern themselves. They quickly descended into savagery. Stephen said, "It was, so far as I can remember, the first book with hands, strong ones that reached out of the pages and seized me by the throat. It said to me, this is not just entertainment, it's life or death. To me, Lord of the Flies has always represented what novels are for, why they are indispensable." While a student at Durham Elementary School, 12-year-old Stephen wrote a short story called Jumper about a police counselor who tries to prevent someone from committing suicide by jumping off the Chrysler Building in New York City. Policemen who are trying to keep him from jumping accidentally knocked him off the ledge. To find out if he survived or not, you'll have to read it for yourself. I don't want to spoil the story for you. Jumper was first published in his older brother David's self-published newspaper called Dave's Rag. In the year 2000, Jumper was published in Secret Windows, Essays in Fiction on the Craft of Writing by Stephen King. His first story published by someone unrelated to him was I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, which was serialized in 1965 over 4 issues of a magazine called Comics Review. After high school, Stephen attended the University of Maine at Orono on a scholarship where he majored in English. He wrote for the student newspaper The Maine Campus, Maine spelled M-A-I-N-E. While a student, he participated in a writing workshop by Professor Burton Hatlin. It was during Professor Hatlin's workshop that Stephen met his future wife, Tabitha Spruce. Stephen said Professor Hatlin was the greatest English teacher I ever had. It was he who first showed me the way to the pool, which he called the language pool, the myth pool, where we would all go down to drink. That was in 1968. I have trod the path that leads there often in the years since, and I can think of no better place to spend one's days. The water is still sweet, and the fish still swim. Mr. Harvey explained how many times Stephen King was turned down as a novelist. He said Stephen was stubborn and stupid. He was stubborn enough and stupid enough to keep trying. We should be so lucky as to be as stubborn and stupid as Stephen King was. We should try things. We may fail, sure, but we shouldn't stop there. We should keep trying and trying and trying. We can achieve a lot more than we think we can. Don't you think? Now, since I've been talking about an author, I'd like to tell you about a nonfiction book that I've been researching for almost a decade. Maybe I'm stubborn and stupid too. It's called The Trap, the untold story of Sheriff Henderson Jordan and the final pursuit of Bonnie and Clyde. You see, I'm a lifelong resident of the parish in which Bonnie and Clyde were killed. All my life I've heard stories about the ambush of Bonnie and Clyde. There were problems with these tales. The stories I heard seemed to contradict each other. There seemed to be more fiction than fact in the books I read or the films I saw on the subject. My intention was not to write a book, but just to satisfy my own desire to learn the facts surrounding Bonnie and Clyde and the ambush. For instance, I had always heard that it was Frank Hamer, the ex-Texas Ranger, who used his superior tracking skills to determine where and when to find Bonnie and Clyde. And I had always heard that it was Frank Hamer who led the ambush. But during my research, I learned that it was not Frank Hamer, but Bienville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan, who, after weeks of quietly searching, located their hideout in Bienville Parish. It was Sheriff Henderson Jordan who planned not one, but 2 traps to capture the gang. It was Sheriff Henderson Jordan who led the posse which ended the crime spree of Bonnie and Clyde, and I prove it in the book. My book is the only one that follows the gang's crime spree in a play-by-play fashion. The gang's crimes included more than 60 car thefts and burglaries, armed robberies, kidnapping, torture, yes, torture, and a dozen murders, all of which I cover in the book. You can scan this QR code to get a copy of the book, or if you don't like scanning QR codes, I'll leave a link to order it in the description below. It comes straight from me. It comes out May 23rd, 2025, the anniversary of the ambush. Now, I hope you enjoy my attempt to achieve more than I believed I could. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.